The following is Class 3 on the Yoga Sutras, given by Hridayananda Das Goswami in fall of 2004 in San Luis Obispo. Sutras 141 to 151 will be covered in this class.
This is what Patanjali has to say tonight to us. He begins this topic by saying, China Briter Abhijatasyeva Maner Grihiter Grahana Grahyeshu Tatstat Taranjanata Samapati. And Barbara Solar Miller points out this is one of the few times in this very terse work that Patanjali uses a metaphor. And he says that, I'll put this in English syntax, for the mind, or when the mind, maner, is kshina vritti. Now if you remember, which literally means that the turnings have decreased or waned or been overcome. The Yoga Sutras began with the statement that yoga means chitta vritti nirodha. That was right off the bat, the definition of yoga. It means nirodha, stopping, checking, impeding the vritti, the turnings of the mind. The mind deviates from clarity and truth. And so now, Patanjali says, for the mind which is kshina vritti, where these turnings have really diminished, so we're making progress here. He says, then the mind is like, there's a word eva there, it's from abhijatasyeva, it's kind of merged phonetically, but it's like a jewel. Correction, the word maner refers to jewel anyway. It's like a jewel which is literally well born. I mean, this is obviously this is idiomatic. Jata is born. And literally a well-born or a noble jewel, a jewel which is, I put an excellent jewel, idiomatically what it means. Which, this jewel has the power of anjana ta. It colors or it tinges. Tatsta, literally that standing. It's just like English, that standing, tatsta, whatever stands next to it. Which colors whatever stands, whatever is colored by, I'm going to say, anything that stands next to it. What this means is, if you take a jewel, say a very clear, precious jewel, a really great jewel, a well-born jewel, then if you place something in front of it, it reflects that object perfectly, without any distortion. It doesn't add or subtract. It's just like a perfect transmitter or magnifier, and so on. That's what we're talking about. So he says, similarly, the mind, when the turnings have ceased, in the act of grihiter, grahana, grahya, which means the perceiver, the perceiving, the perceived, literally the grasper, the grasping, that which is to be grasped, in the sense of perception, grasping in the sense of understanding. So I'm going to put all this together. I'm pointing out all these things, and I'm going to try to make it more coherent. Anyway, what all this adds up to is samapati, which I translated as accomplished meditation, because samapati literally means an accomplishment, like achieving. And so he's referring to accomplished meditation, I think is a good way to put it. So I'll review all that again. What he's saying here is that the consciousness, the mind, should function as a transparent lens, so to speak. So that whatever is near our mind, whatever comes within our proximity, either conceptually or sensorially, a physical object, whatever comes into the proximity of our consciousness, the consciousness, you have to remember also that in this philosophical system, you are not your mind. The mind is an instrument. You are the soul, and you have a mind. The mind is a faculty, a cognitive faculty that you have. And so therefore, the mind's purpose is, and again, to put this in the context of this ancient culture, to quote from the Gita, we have the phrase, manakshashtani indriyani. The senses, like the eyes and the ears, are six with the mind. So the mind is seen as the pivot, the coordinating facility for all the five senses. For example, right now, you're hearing things because I'm speaking. You're seeing things. You're feeling things because you have a sense of touch. There may be there's some aroma or odor here, and so on. And you can taste. There's always some little taste in your mouth. And yet, how do you focus? How is it that you you're listening. You're not focusing, let's say, right now on what it feels like to sit on the blanket, or maybe you're not staring at the wall and noticing the color. Maybe you are. So that faculty which can coordinate all of the sense information that's coming in, organize it into a coherent experience in which you can focus or concentrate, that's the mind's function. That's typically, in this whole ancient psychology, that's what the mind does. So therefore, when we're talking here about the mind functioning as a transparent, or like a transparent jewel, so it gives you absolutely objective information about whatever you come near, then you have to keep in mind, number one, that's your mind. You are not the mind. The mind is feeding you information. And also the mind coordinates all the sense perceptions. So within that context, it's a general statement about consciousness. That when your meditation becomes more advanced, you become objective. That your faculties, your sense faculties in your mind become clear and objective. That's basically what he's saying, like a jewel which is transparent. And can even, like a lens, magnify things and sharpen your perception of them without distorting the object. So that's what potentially he's talking about here. It's a sort of common sense. So that's accomplished meditation. And then he says, Etayaiva savichara nirvichara sasukshma vishaya vyakhyata. By this alone, first I'll read my translation, accomplished meditation with and without reflection with a subtle object is explained. And he's going to explain what a subtle object is. Maybe I'll read the next one also so you get to see what he's talking about. Sukshma vishaya tvam chalinga parayavasanam. Being a subtle object amounts to not having a visible mark. In other words, to give a simple example, let's say you have a dream house. You've never found it. It's not some house you actually saw somewhere that you hope to buy someday, but you have in your mind the kind of house you'd like to have. And so, or you'd like to build someday. And so, from this Vedic point of view, the house in a sense exists in a subtle form called a vyakta. It has the type of, and then that mental impression kind of gets translated into a real thing in the world. In fact, also in terms of the creation of the universe, the whole universe exists in a subtle form, actually within the mind of God, you could say. And if you know Western philosophy, Berkeley's idealism, and going back actually to Augustine, who Augustine was a Platonist, really. He read, Plato and Plotinus, and so I don't quote all that now. But anyway, there's a statement in the letters of Paul that Jesus is the wisdom of God, and so he sees that literally as that somehow the creation, everything is in God's mind, and Jesus and anyway. So this idea that everything that exists within the mind of God is sort of a perennial philosophical concept. And there's something like that in Vedic culture. There's something like that before the universe is actually created, everything exists in a subtle form within the mind of the Creator and then gradually comes out. And so there's this whole interest in the subtle forms of things. In fact, the mind itself is called the Sukshma Rupa, or Sharira, the subtle body. So that we have our physical body, and the mind is actually called a body. A Sukshma is a subtle body. And so here he's talking about, basically, it's almost like what we say in English, getting a little mental about something. Because, I mean, imagine, first of all, if you know the ancient yoga practice, if you're doing this thing, if you're doing the yoga program in ancient times, you're off somewhere in some remote place. As it said in Gita, ekaki, secluded, alone. What's that? In a sacred place, in a very secluded place, probably the Himalayan mountains, or at least the foothills. And there's not much going on. And so you're sitting there for a very long period of time, and you can get very mental. Because usually if you're up there doing yoga, you had a life before that. You might have had a family, and you obviously were born into a family. You might have had some trade, and you decided to take up yoga. Because the yogis were generally, for the most part, they were celibate, so there weren't like a lot of big extended yoga families up there. They were pretty much, it was a pretty individual thing. And so people generally have a previous life, and when you get up there and you're practicing, or even nowadays when you're trying to meditate, you can get very mental. Your mind can prey on you. There's this great line, if you know, anyway, I'm a Jane Austen nut, so there's this great line in Persuasion where there's this debate going on at the end whether who is truer in love, men or women, who forgets first and who remembers longest. And so they're debating this, and then anyway, so then there's this debate between a ship captain, who's a good guy, and then Anne, who's sort of the heroine of the story, and they both give arguments for their sex. And so Anne's argument is that speaking about early Victorian culture, let's say around the early part of the 19th century, that we women are generally, we stay at home. We don't go out in the world like you men do. You're a ship captain, a naval captain. And she said, because we're always at home, our minds prey on us. And anyway, I just thought that's one of the arguments. So similarly, if you're a yogi up in the mountains, your mind can really get you because there's, you can't go shopping and forget about it. You can't go to a movie. You can't even talk to anyone. So, anyway, so there's this whole world of subtle things. So, what is he saying here? That, oh my God, I skipped a few verses.
I was going to ask you to go back eventually. You're in a hurry tonight. I was wondering that too.
You guys are so polite. This shows we're in San Luis Obispo, right?
We just started throwing eggs at you.
If I was in LA, you would be honking. You're all so nice. I apologize, but all right. So now you've got previews of coming attractions. So 42. Tatra Shabdartha Jnana Vikalpai Sankirna Savitarka Samapati. In that state of samapati, accomplished meditation, when samapati is filled with imaginings, that's vikalpas, based on knowledge, jnana, of word meanings, shabdartha, it is called accomplished meditation with speculative doubts. And the word which I translate speculative doubts is vitarka, some with sub-vitarka. And I wrote down on one of these sheets. The word here are a few meanings of vitarka. Vitarka can mean conjecture, supposition, guess, fancy, doubt, especially in a yoga context, doubt and uncertainty. So I tried to synthesize those meanings, and certainly to include the special yoga meaning with my translation, speculative doubts. And again, your mind preying on you, and these are imaginings. If you have this accomplished meditation, it's interesting, you sort of, how should I put it? You have conquered or diminished the ordinary mundane turnings of the mind. I mean, ordinary things like getting a little sleepy during your meditation, or remembering the girl you left behind, or the boy you left behind, or getting angry at someone, remembering some old grudge or something, or it's all this stuff. So you've kind of conquered that, and you're seeing things clearly. However, and this is the point, to some extent you've intellectualized your way into this accomplished meditation. I mean, as we know, sometimes we say to ourselves, it's really stupid that I'm suffering over that person. I mean, why should I care about that person, or why should I care what that person did to me? And you start to sort of almost like, rationally, intellectually try to free yourself from an unreasonable suffering. Like it's not, I shouldn't worry about that. Or why am I so worried? I'm obsessing about that. And so if you think about it, for people that kind of are intelligent, a lot of times what we do when we're suffering or in anxiety or just not pleased with the state of consciousness we're in, for whatever reason, is we try to be reasonable about it. We keep preaching to ourselves, don't be foolish, don't be silly about that, and so on. And so that's kind of what he's talking about here. That you've gotten yourself into a state of accomplished meditation by using your reason and your intelligence. But at a certain point, that itself is kind of like a lot of background noise in your head. And so you're not just, as you said, in the now, you're not just totally experiencing life because you've got all this machinery, rational machinery that's kind of keeping you aloft. And so, yes.
I just wondered which words refer to what. First of all, jhana, which is.
Oh, jnana?
Oh, is it jnana?
Well, it's pronounced J-N, but it's kind of like the Sanskrit lasagna, where, G-N is pronounced N-Y.
Jnana.
So, and it's funny because when you go into like Sanskrit courses in real good universities, professors are kind of real purists and they say jnana.
Oh.
But in India, for I don't know how long, everyone says jnana. In fact, they even write it sometimes G-Y-A-N.
Oh.
Related to the Greek gnosis, like knowledge.
Oh.
Like agnostic, not knowing.
So it is related to jnana yoga.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, jnana is just the common word knowledge. I think it's probably, even our English word knowledge, I think is related to it.
Oh.
Jnana, knowledge, probably related.
And then,
To know.
which is word meaning? Word
Shabda. Shabda, which can mean sound and also means word, and artha means meaning or value.
Thank you.
Sure. Shabda, artha, jnana, word, meaning, knowledge. So now Patanjali is talking about this samapati, this accomplished meditation, but it's with vitarka, all this thinking and conjecturing and reasoning about it. And he says it's based on imagining, because if you think about it, we think verbally, and we think about, when we reason, we're kind of talking to ourselves in our head about things. And so it's not, in other words, we're not in the now, we're not experiencing like that big shala tree over there, to give a nice Himalayan tree, hardwood tree. I'm not just seeing that shala tree, I'm not just seeing the river go by, I'm not just experiencing the fact that I'm alive as part of God. I'm thinking, well, I shouldn't really, and so it's a whole verbal, rational thing. And so that's the vikalpa. We're imagining all kinds of dialogues. I should have told her, why didn't I tell her, why didn't he, and so on, and so that's what he's talking about. It's a real practical, common sense term. Then, smriti parishuddho. Kind of thrilling here. Smriti parishuddho, swarupa shunyevartha matra nirvasa nirvitarka. When memory is fully purified and only the object of perception shines forth, only the mind's object appears, and one's accomplished meditation, devoid of its own identity, has no speculative doubt. So, smriti is memory. Shuddhi is purity. And pari is just the Greek peri, like perimeter, around, periscope, and everything. And so it uses a prefix in Sanskrit to mean completely, all around. So parishuddho is just a locative case, meaning when that happens. When there is complete purity of memory. And your samapti, your accomplished meditation, is eva, like shunyat, as if it is devoid swarupa, of its own form. And I'll explain what all this means. And then arthamata nirvasa, and only the object literally shines forth or appears. That is called nir, without vitarka, all the speculative doubts. So what does this mean? When we are engaged in vitarka, like reasoning our way to detachment, and trying to, kind of reason with ourselves to let go of things and so on. There's all this discursive, verbal, logical stuff going on. Which is obviously based on things we remember, because when you're up there in the mountains meditating, it's like, why didn't I tell him that, and why did I do this, and I should never have, whatever. Yeah. And so, therefore, Patanjali says, when your memory is completely purified, your memory is pure, so there's no bad memories, there's no bad stuff in there anymore. The bad stuff, you let go of the bad stuff. Then, the mind, which has a structure, which has its own dynamic, it thinks, and so on. It's as if it doesn't have its own form. In other words, you're not bringing the mind's structure to the experience. I don't even go into Kant's theory of the a priori structures of the mind which are necessary for experience. But Kant, I won't even go there now because it's...
We all know that.
Yeah. But, because it would be an amazing comparison. But, so the mind, it's as if, how should I put it? The perfect eyeglasses are in a sense eyeglasses that you never notice. I mean, they could be so light, like, they weigh 0 pounds or something. In other words, if you could have glasses that don't weigh anything and you never notice them, you just perceive. That's the perfect set of glasses. So the perfect mind is a mind that, in a sense, doesn't bring anything extraneous to the experience. It doesn't color your experience with its own structures and stuff that's going on. It just acts transparently so that you can perceive what's really out there.
So is that mind? Because I guess I associate mind with just being.
Right. Well, mind, let me talk a little more about that. I mentioned it. Mind is not used in the way it's used in the Western tradition, where, for example, for the Greeks, the word psyche, which now we would say psyche, but they would have psyche, meant just sort of, it could be the spirit or the soul, the self, it meant consciousness. The Sanskrit thing was much more precise. So that even in the Gita you have, first you have the senses. Well, then you have the sense objects, just like matter, material things, visible things, forms, forms and sounds and aromas and so on. Then you have the senses. The senses are organized around the mind. The mind is the center of the senses in this conception. Coordinate, in order for you to have a sane, coherent experience, you have to be coordinating because all the senses are giving you data at every moment. So the mind is, coordinating it. That's the mind. And it's the mind which coordinates sense data because the mind likes things and doesn't like things and feels like it and doesn't feel like it. And that's the mind.
It judges.
Yeah, it can judge. Exactly. Like, that's good, that's bad. But then the intelligence is the rational part, above the mind. This is interesting. And this same as Plato's Republic, if you know it. Above the mind is the intelligence, which is reasonable. Like, typical example, the mind says, or let's say the mind says, hey man, I could really use a drink right now. In the pejorative sense of the term. And your intelligence says, you don't need that. You got to drive right now. You're going to kill someone. You're going to mutilate yourself. You don't need to. So the intelligence is rational, cool, calm, and collected, reasoning. And so whereas the mind may be judgmental, the intelligence will actually be reasonable about it and say, well, is it fair to say that so-and-so is this or that? So you have the sense objects, the senses, the mind, the intelligence, and above everything, the soul, the person, the self, with all these faculties. So, actually, Patanjali in these verses doesn't actually use the word mind. He's talking about meditation. You can say it's about chitta or consciousness, but the mind really is kind of the center of yoga practice. And but here we're talking sort of in general about consciousness and imagine a yogi. Imagine what's really going on. The yogi sitting there, he or she is sitting there, and the senses are used to seeing things and hearing things. You have to focus inward, and you've got all these memories, and you're also trying to be intellectualize your way out of miserable attachments, and all this is going on. It's like a real rodeo, and all this is going on. So then Patanjali says that, but when your memory is purified, then the mind or consciousness, you could say consciousness or even intelligence, is not bringing its own structures and machinery into the experience. And And artha matra, the word artha, remember the word meaning from the previous verse?
Right.
Yeah, shabd artha. So artha means, it can mean money, because since it means value or object or meaning. It means all those things. So, for purpose. So artha matra. Matra, by the way, related to the word meter or metric, the measure. And it's a way in Sanskrit of saying only that, like only this much, no more, no less. Just that measure. So artha matra. Just the artha, just the object of consciousness. Just that. Nirbhasa literally shines out or appears. So the object itself appears to you as the self, as the soul, and the mind or intelligence, the conscious, is not imposing its own machinery and stuff on it. Just the object. Just the facts, man.
That's what it means, its own identity.
What's that?
Its own identity, that means.
Exactly, its own form, because the word identity, Swarupa there, where it says shunya, which means devoid. Devoid of Swarupa, Rupa is form, its own form, it's Swarupa. It's not imposing its own form on the experience. The object only is coming out, is appearing to you. And that is called samapatti, accomplished meditation near vitarka, near, without. Without the vitarka, without all these speculative doubts and conjectures and reasonings and analyses and everything. So is that clear? Now we come to the pre-talked about verse. So, etaya eva, by this accomplished meditation alone, in other words, only by this one, which doesn't have all the mental stuff and intellectual stuff going on, it can be sa-vichara or near vichara. It gets very technical because vichara is kind of a synonym of vitarka. But it means kind of like pondering, contemplating, pondering. It's not... The word tarka, by the way, by itself, to show you the difference. The first word, tarka, is also the common sense word for logic. It's a common word for logic, reasoning, nyaya or tarka. And so vitarka is more like meditation where you're really thinking about things and analyzing, and why did I desire that, and is that pure, or maybe that's not pure, and just analyzing your former attachments and everything. Whereas vichara is more kind of like pondering things. It's more of a... But it's somewhat synonymous. So it's like different stages of becoming free of this worrying about your meditation and worrying about your own happiness on the path. So then Patanjali says that by this meditation without the vitarka, there still can be vichara. So I'm going to read you some of the meanings of vichara, try to give you some idea. Because getting into subtleties here and nuances. Vichara can mean pondering, considering, reflecting, examining, investigating. It can also mean doubt or hesitation. So it overlaps with vitarka. But still, Patanjali is saying that there's another stage where there may be or may not be vichara. And there's sukshma vishaya, subtle object. Vishaya also means like an object. By this alone, accomplished meditation with and without reflection with the subtle object is explained. If I can just take back something I did, sense I think what Patanjali is really saying here is that what he's just explained, vyakyata, what he's just explained, is that in your meditation, sometimes you're thinking about things, sometimes you're not. So it looks like vichara is just like a synonym here of vitarka. What he's saying is now, by this alone, is explained how you can have a meditation which has sukshma vishayas. Because again, vitarka and vichara it's not about actually seeing something in the moment. It's not like you're meditating, but you're, a little bird flew by and that caught your eye and you're watching the bird. Vitarka and vichara are things going on in your head. And so you're, in a sense, you've gotten beyond the physical world. You're no longer engaged in trying to enjoy the physical world. I mean, a person at this stage, in this ancient yoga practice, would certainly be celibate. And so there's no sexual dimension to this ancient practice, and there's no social life, and there's no ancient Vedic shopping malls or whatever they did, whatever the ancient equivalent of bowling alleys is or golf courses. I mean, they had all kinds of. So, in other words, you're not doing any of that stuff. You're just sitting there in your head. And this is what he's talking about, because you're no longer grossly going after the physical world and not even desiring it. The mind's not even getting distracted like I'm overcome by lust or greed or jealousy or all this stuff. That's not happening to me. But in order to get free of that stuff, I've had to think about it a lot and analyze it and monitor my meditation, like, was that a pure thought I just had? And what's happening now? And so what Patanjali is saying is that when you get to the point that you're not grossly entangled in the material world, either by actually doing things or even by having them bother you and trouble you and agitate you, you're beyond that. So it's samapati, it's an accomplished meditation. You've gotten beyond that, but to get beyond that, you've had to really do a lot of thinking about it and reasoning and worrying and doubting, because you have to doubt, like, was that pure, was that not pure? And then he's saying that you can get to the point even beyond that mental stuff. So that's kind of what he's talking about here. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's sort of, that's actually what he's talking about. That's why it's sukshma, it's subtle, because it's at the level of just reasoning, analyzing these things, as opposed to trying to enjoy them, being agitated by them. And then he says, Ta'iva, sabija samadhi. These accomplished meditations alone are samadhi with seed. So it's a state of absorption, it's a type of trance or absorption. But as we know, only too well. Let's say just give a common example in this world. Someone who loved and lost, or you were hurt by someone with whom you had a relationship. And so, you just sort of think about it occasionally, like 18 hours a day for about 13 years. So the idea is that we remember our old attachments, or something we left behind, or whatever, and then it's like a chain. It's where you think about it, you can't stop, and then because you thought about it today, you told yourself you wouldn't think about it today, so then you think about it tomorrow, and it perpetuates itself. That's the bija thing. It's mental and intellectual conditioning, where we develop mental habits, and so when you're meditating and you're worrying about your attachments and worrying about the suffering, because this world it can hurt us, and so when you're trying to meditate and you're trying to get free of that stuff and push off from it and get a new life and all that, and so that very process of worrying and struggling itself becomes a mental habit that perpetuates itself, and ultimately it's something you have to transcend to get to the state of just pure consciousness, where you're just perceiving things objectively. So that's what this topic really is. And that's the bija. It keeps, because think of what a bija really is. A seed. There's a tree or a plant. It grows. It puts out a seed. The seed produces another plant, which puts out seeds that produce another plant. So it's this perpetuating the same mental habits.
And you have to get beyond it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Where it's no longer a struggle or an analysis, it's just clear consciousness.
Oh, but it is a type of samadhi with the seed.
It is, because it's successful. Samapati has the sense, it sounds in Sanskrit also kind of like successful, accomplished. So you really are in higher consciousness. But it's almost like the difference between, let's say having this real noisy old airplane that makes us, real loud engines, as opposed to just being able to fly. So I like that analogy. Somehow just descended. So I think the sabija samadhi, or the savitaraka or savichara, meaning with, is you are in higher consciousness, but there's all these engines going on, all these intellectual and mental engines going on that are keeping you aloft. And if you kind of slip and if you forget to remind yourself why you don't want to go back to that situation, it may start to kind of seduce you a little bit. So you've got to keep the engines going. And so when you get to the point where you're just, like volare, you're just flying, you're just there. And the engine, you don't need the engines anymore. That's the pure soul. The pure soul doesn't need all these rational mental engines to stay up in the air.
Aligned.
Yeah. So, then nirvichara vaishara de dhyatma prasada. In mental clarity, without reflection, the higher self finds felicity. Hope you all will accept that somewhat Victorian word, I like, the felicity. The higher self finds felicity, real happiness. Okay, there's a lot going on here. Vaisharadya means clarity. Clarity. So, and nirvichara in the clarity or mental clarity which is near vichara, in which you're not worrying about things, you're not mentally, intellectually struggling to stay up there. It's just near vichara vaisharagya. There is adhyatma prasada. Actually, I'll use the board here because these are really cool words in Sanskrit. And these are very... Atma, you should know the word Atma means self or soul. And the prefix adi, and the I here becomes a Y just for euphonics to make it sound better. But the original is literally this means over, like who's that guy? Oh my God. Nietzsche. He talks about his Uber Mensch, the over man or the over person, in the sense of higher. And so Uber, this is kind of like the word adi, it means over or above. So a simple translation would be the higher self, the adhyatma, because the word atma is also a reflexive pronoun in Sanskrit. Like if you have, let's say, like a self-service island in an ancient gas station, it would be the atma seva, self-service. So they use the word self in Sanskrit exactly as we do, as a reflexive pronoun, self-service, self-taught, etc., etc. So when they want to be clear that we're talking about the soul, this is a spiritual context, we're talking about the spiritual self, they often will use the word adi, higher, like the higher self, meaning we're really talking about the soul here. So that's the word adhyatma. And then prasada is also the word which is used in the tradition to mean grace. It means happiness or tranquility, but in the sense of a sublime state of happiness. So in India, for example, in Hindu traditions or the Vaishnava tradition, prasada refers to spiritual food. When you take food, and if you know your Homer, by the way, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, you'll know that in ancient Greek civilization also no one ever eats or drinks anything unless it's been offered to the gods. They wouldn't imagine it. So in India, you have these two words, bhoga, which means enjoyment, just means food that hasn't been offered to God, and then prasada is literally grace, or food that's been offered to God. So it means clarity in the sense of a sublime state of grace. And you really hear that in the word prasad. And I had to pick a word, so I picked clarity or whatever I picked here. But
is prasada, is it clarity or is it
felicity? Yeah, felicity. That's right, felicity. But it's a very rich word in Sanskrit. It's all that is there, sort of a state of grace, and where you've been blessed and you're happy and you're peaceful and clear. It really means all that. It sounds like all that.
There is clarity, mental clarity, though.
Yeah, that's the Vaisharagya. The Vaisharagya. So when you get to the point of meditation where it's near vichara, you're not worried about things, you're not struggling mentally and intellectually, then your higher self experiences this state of grace, this happiness, this tranquility, peace. That's what it says. And then the next one, Ritambara Tatra Pragya. In that state, wisdom bears truth. And the word vara related to our word bear, by the way, to bear, to carry. Pragya, wisdom. Wisdom, pragya, becomes ritambara. It bears truth. The word rita, by the way, there are different words in Sanskrit that mean truth. I won't go into all of them here, but the common word like tell the truth, don't lie, is satyam. And here the word rita is actually it has an interesting history. Rita, which here has an M because it's the object of the verb. Rita is a very old word found in the Vedas, and it's considered to be a word which sort of is the forerunner to the word dharma, which you don't find as much in the oldest Sanskrit literatures you find in still very old but not as old Sanskrit literature. So Rita is generally explained as meaning a type of cosmic truth, a principle which somehow makes the universe real. And so it's a truth in the sense of a serious, profound cosmic truth.
So is Ratam truth or is it?
Yeah, Ritam. Yeah. I mean, technically there's a vowel R, like in the English word bird. If you think of the English word bird, like birdie, the vowel is the R. It's not really an I, it's not beard. It's really bird. The R is actually a vowel, bird or curd and all, so fur. The word fur, it's not fur, it's spelled F-U-R, but it's actually fur. The vowel is the R. So if you wanted to be a phonetic purist, which I sometimes am when I'm not in a social context, then you really pronounce this sort of like Urta. But no one does it. Even in India, they kind of spell it R-I, and like Krishna, the word Krishna. It's really a vowel R. And then Bara is like our English word bear, to carry. Those words are related, Bara and bear. So bearing truth. That's what it means. And so pra, I really want to sort of share with you all what's really going on here. Gya is the root to know, which we get gyana. So gya is just the verb to know, a knower, and pra is like English fourth or pro. Like it's sort of like it sort of energizes the verb. And so pragya is sort of like penetrating knowledge. That's kind of what it sounds like, penetrating knowledge, which we translate as wisdom.
Could you say about pra again?
It means like fourth. It energizes. It's a prefix. We do this, like pro knowledge, or not professional, but in the sense of like in favor of knowledge or penetrating or going forth. Mm-hmm. Penetrating. By the way, English, because its relation to Sanskrit, has the same basic structure. Like to give a simple example, take our stem, vert, V-E-R-T. And then you can have invert, subvert, pervert, convert, revert. So we have the same structure in English, but we have a verbal stem and all these prefixes. And that's from Sanskrit.
So the pra is it's from Sanskrit.
Yeah. So the pra is the prefix. And then ya is the verb to know, from which you get yam.
Do they have suffixes also?
Yeah. Like the anam, from which you get gyam, which makes a neuter noun. But they're generally not semantic as much. They just like make a noun out of a verbal root, but the semantic elements that really color and give meaning, they're often prefixes. So what's really being said here is that when you get this penetrating knowledge which really gets into it, then it carries with it this cosmic truth. So that's kind of all in the words.
That's a pretty heavy one then.
Yeah. And tatra, therein, meaning in this meditation, which is free of all the mental machinery.
That's a wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, tatra, in that meditation. Tatra means in that meditation, pragya, wisdom or penetrating knowledge, bears cosmic truth. It brings cosmic truth. What time is it, by the way? I don't want to abuse your time. Oh, can we go a few more minutes? So, these will finish this chapter. Then, Shutanumana pragyabhyam anya vishaya visheshartatvat. That's fascinating. What that means is that if you're sort of like an epistemology fan like I am, because it has a special purpose, this wisdom has a different focus than the wisdom of scripture and logical inference. So I will, as it's now popular to say in college classes, unpack this. So, there's a very standard classification of knowledge, of different kinds of evidence, which is being appealed to here. It's very standard in this ancient culture. So that the lowest kind of knowledge would be called pratyaksha, which means sense perception. In other words, you just see something because it's so illusory. I mean, you can see a straw bend in a cup in a glass of water, right? I mean, so that kind of stuff where you just see something. There's no reasoning behind it. And then there's anumana, which is interesting. So the first word is sense perception. Then anumana, which is given here, Anu means following or consequent, and mana is from the verb man, to think. Like mana. And so it means like sort of thinking about it afterwards. In other words, you saw something with your senses, but then you think about it. Well, is that straw really bent? So that would be anumana. And then the highest form of evidence in this ancient system is hearing from an authority. And here, this is an interesting point which is also made in relation actually to Augustinian philosophy, that and in general, that sort of like late classical theology, that authority here doesn't mean someone that has the power to insist that you accept something. It's not a political idea of authority. It's the natural authority that comes when you really know something. So let's say you really know how to teach yoga. So whether someone believes you or not, you have a natural authority because you know it. So that's what's it's that kind of authority.
The wisdom.
Yeah. And it's the word shruta, literally that which is heard, which is a very common name for the Vedas. So the idea is if you hear from enlightened people who truly know, you can get the highest knowledge, because by our sense perception and by our reasoning about what we experience, we can't achieve the highest knowledge, which comes from people that are really there. Like Krishna says in the Gita, what is that famous verse that Upadekshanti te jnanam jnaninas? Those who have knowledge will teach you knowledge. Those who have knowledge, knowledge will teach. And so, but here, he makes a very interesting statement, Patanjali. He says that this samapatti, or this pragya, this wisdom we're talking about, this meditation, has anya is another, vishaya, another object. It has another object. Then the objects of pragya, wisdom, pragyabhyam, is the dual. There's a dual form from the two wisdoms based on shruta and anumana. Is what he's saying. So he's saying apart from the two wisdoms, pragyabhyam, based on shruta and anumana, hearing from authority and reasoning about things, apart from those two wisdoms, this wisdom, which he just talked about in 148, this wisdom has anya vishaya, it has another object, because it has a different purpose. Again, the word artha. Vishesha is distinct or different or special. So it can mean also because it has a special purpose. That's the common word for special. Special or distinct. This is a fascinating statement. I mean, if you think about what Patanjali is saying, well, first of all, what he's not saying that this wisdom that we're doing here on the yoga path. Because Patanjali is very aware that he's just explaining one path. It's like, let's say you teach at Cal Poly. You're aware there are many other colleges in the country, and you're not saying that this is the only college, but this is what we do here. And so Patanjali is saying that there are other pragyas. There are other deep understandings. There are other wisdoms based on shruta, just hearing from. Because you can take up yoga, or you can, let's say, very faithfully and devotedly hear, let's say, Bhagavad Gita, which according to the Gita will also enlighten you, if you hear with devotion and faith. And so, or you can reason it, that's the jnana yoga. In a sense, the anumana pragya, the reasoning wisdom, is the jnana yoga, the yoga path of knowledge. And so Patanjali is not saying this is better. He's just saying we have a special purpose here. Or we have a different purpose here, which is to reach a particular meditative state, as opposed to just by devotion, or other things. And therefore, because of that, there's a different object in our wisdom. It's a different approach. We're in a different terrain.
Focus or
direction. Yeah, because the word vishaya also means a terrain or region. It's just like, for example, we can talk in English intelligibly about mental terrain. In a sense, that's the word he's used. It's a difference because we're in another mental terrain here. And because we have a special purpose, we have a distinct purpose, which is to achieve enlightenment through this yoga path, as opposed to devotion or all these other things, studying scriptures.
Logical inference, is that
Anumana.
Is that sensory perception also, or
the word for sense perception is pratyaksha, by through each sense. So pratyaksha sense, but again, it's the same thing I told you before. You have the senses grouped around the mind. So similarly, first you have the sense perception, and then ultimately you have anumana, reasoning about your experiences, and reasoning about and reasoning about what's beyond your experience, and so on.
And that's inference.
Yeah, inference. To give a perfect example, a perfect example is Plato. Let's say, for example, I just did this. So let's say here's a triangle, and you're doing the Pythagorean theorem. Let's say this is side A, side B, side C, and this is a right angle. So A squared plus B squared equals C squared. The Pythagorean theorem. So now, Plato's whole point is this: that this is not, no matter how well you draw a triangle, and this is not a great triangle, but no matter how well you draw a triangle, it's never a perfect triangle. It's never perfect. It's never exactly the triangle this theorem refers to. He said, but Plato says, this is one of the basic points of Plato's philosophy, with your intelligence, with your mind, in inference, you can sort of see in your mind's eye, to use the word, you can see in your mind's eye a perfect triangle that you can never draw. And so it's a perfect triangle is intelligible, but not perceptible by the senses. And so, for example, justice. You can't see a justice. We reason our way to justice. First of all, the value of it. We conclude that, yes, we want justice. It's a positive value. And we can reason about what is justice in a particular case. What is fair in this situation. So that's anumana. That's not about things you can see or touch in the world.
Yeah, so sense perception is something physical that has a form that
exactly.
You can touch and...
You touch or hear or see or smell or taste. Those
whereas inference is just in your mind.
Exactly. And it's considered higher.
Is it imagination?
Not necessarily, because, for example, we would probably want to say that there really is justice. There really is such a thing as justice, and there really is, at some spiritual level, an equality among all creatures. Which suddenly by our senses, we can never find two creatures that are the same. And yet, the notion of equality is something which is beyond the mere, let's say, animal perception of other creatures. Love, compassion, justice, equality, these are all things that we can infer, but you can't perceive them with your senses. So all these things were known back then. And potentially assumes that you know that. So he's saying that he's acknowledging that there are other paths, which he respects, but we have a special purpose here, and therefore we're in a different mental terrain, which is literally what he's saying. And then maybe we'll just finish up this chapter today. And so tajja samskaro anya samskara pratibandhi. This is good news. A mental impression born of this wisdom obstructs other mental impressions. So the samskaras, this is a technical yoga word which you see a lot in yoga literature. The samskara is, I'm almost tempted to use the Freudian word, which would be the, what is it? The id. It's like all this stuff and this unconscious, subconscious stuff that's driving you. It's obviously not just precisely the id, which has a special Freudian sense, but the idea that because of the choices I've made in the past, and because of the experiences I've had in the past, not only in this life, but in many lives, I am predisposed emotionally and intellectually and even physically to act in certain ways. I'm kind of like I'm conditioned.
Samskara.
Yeah, that's samskara, those subtle or subliminal impressions, and sometimes predisposed against things. Like, let's say someone has a phobia. Let's say in a past life, someone fell off a cliff. And in this life, they're afraid of heights. Or let's say in a past life, someone had a very wonderful relationship with a particular person. And they're predisposed towards people with certain personality traits, and they don't know why. So it's just all that conditioning. It's all the effect of our previous experiences and choices that predispose us. In a sense, the samskaras are the way that karma manifests. And not only, but at least at a psychological level. I mean, karma also means things just happen to you, or you're born in a certain family, or you have a certain body, a certain whatever. But also in the sense that you're predisposed, that you're inclined, that you like certain things and don't like certain things, and easily become attached to certain kinds of people and can't stand other kinds of people. And just all that stuff is the samskaras, these subtle, unconscious memories. So what Patanjali is saying is that when you're in the state of meditation, you're coming to this wisdom, and it also becomes a mental habit. It also becomes an experience, and every experience kind of has some mental momentum. It's just like, if let's say if I take one step toward you, there's momentum, so it takes another energy to stop. Otherwise, you sort of, yeah. So, I mean, well, Newton said it. He said that every object at rest tends to stay at rest, and every object in motion tends to continue in motion unless something stops it. So that also is true for mental motions and emotional motions and intellectual motions and all that. And so as you get into meditation, that becomes your mental world, or you start to develop that habit, and that starts to perpetuate itself. The habit or the custom or the tendency to be in higher consciousness, that samskara will take the place of and block the old samskaras. Krishna actually says this in a very nice way. Krishna in the Gita, in the second chapter, he says that people try to give up sense objects just by fasting or just giving them up, renouncing things. He said, but the taste is still there. You still have a taste for it. It's like, for example, let's say someone is trying to control sex desire, and so therefore they fast, which is an ancient strategy for controlling sex desire in monastic traditions and everything. So someone's fasting. Now, when you fast and you're kind of getting a little thin, I mean, you're not going to be very lusty or greedy or anything. You're just going to be kind of hanging out. Because that's, because your body is weakened. So you may not experience that strong lust or whatever because you've been fasting, but as soon as you eat, it's like, it's like you're back in action. And so that's literally what Krishna is saying there. He says, but then he says, if you see something, if you experience something higher, a higher pleasure, then you actually give up the lower things. In a sense, Patanjali is saying something similar. That we have all these memories and experiences, but if you start to have a whole tradition in your life of higher consciousness and experiences and feelings about it and thinking about it, it blocks all the bad stuff, all the